People often think that when we say trans ideology, we mean trans people. And that's not it at all. It's about the belief that there can be an inner identity that in some sense makes you a man or a woman, or indeed non-binary, rather than those just being material facts about the species that we are, that we're male and female, and there are no non-binary people, because everybody's either male or female.
Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Joining me today is renowned journalist Helen Joyce. Helen is the author of Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, the canonical book on trans ideology and its negative impact on children, women's rights, education, law, freedom of expression, and society in general. Helen studied mathematics at Cambridge University and University College London, gaining a PhD in geometric measure theory. She was a journalist at The Economist for 17 years, holding leading roles including education correspondent, Brazil bureau chief, and finance and international editor. In 2022, Helen published her book, Trans, which became an immediate bestseller. She now works for the British charity Sex Matters, which promotes clarity about sex in law, policy, and language in order to protect everybody's rights. And now I give you Helen Joyce. Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue, Helen. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's fantastic having you on. Now, we're going to be talking about trans ideology, which seems to have successfully embedded itself in many of our public and private institutions. And what I'd like to do is explore how and why this has happened and what the ramifications are for multiple fields in our society. So to start, can you articulate what trans ideology is and what your concerns are?
Sure. So people often think that when we say trans ideology, we mean trans people, like people who identify as trans. And that's not it at all. It's about the belief that there can be an inner identity that in some sense makes you a man or a woman, or indeed non-binary, rather than those just being material facts about the species that we are, that we're male and female, and there are no non-binary people because everybody's either male or female. So if you start from the position that people would have until even, depends where you are, in academia it might be 20, 25 years ago, in ordinary life no more than 5 years ago, I think really everybody would have agreed that there just are two sexes and that's a brute fact about nature. And then they might have understood that there are people who are not happy with the sex that they are, and depending on how much they knew about it and whether they'd ever come across anyone like that, they might have thought, well, we need to make some special accommodations for those people. And that is still what some people, a lot of people, think we're talking about, but we're not. We're talking about an ideology, meaning a theory of what it is to be human, that says that we have innate identities and that those identities include the question of whether we're male, female, man, woman, or something in between, like non-binary or gender fluid or something like that. And that's not something that most people think is true. And there isn't any empirical evidence for it. It's a belief system. So it's a very recently emerging belief system, and it's one that changes all the time. Like whenever you argue with one bit of it, they'll shift to another ground. But it has permeated our institutions to the most extraordinary degree, incredibly quickly. Like, I think there was probably a lot happening before all us normies realised, but I don't think anyone can deny that it's accelerated a lot in recent years. So when people say trans women are women, or you must use preferred pronouns, or please use whichever restrooms fit your gender identity best, what they're doing is they're giving a specific instance of a general belief about humans, which is that the biological sex that we are, that's a material fact, is not at all important, but that what we say we are about whether we're a man or a woman is very, very important, and so important that everybody else should just accept it as read. So that's the issue that I see with it, is that everybody else has to go along with it. So if somebody tells me that they're Muslim or gay or atheist, or, that despite being very pale-skinned, they actually are a quarter black when they look back through their ancestry, I take those things as read. Of course, I'm not going to argue with somebody about any of that. For a start, they're really the only person I can think of who'd know that. But also, it just doesn't impinge upon me in any way. Like if somebody says they're Muslim or Catholic or whatever religion, I don't think they're right about the universe. I'm an atheist. I think their beliefs are incorrect. But I know they're correct that they are Muslim or Catholic or atheist. And it just doesn't impinge upon me because we have freedom of belief and freedom of speech. So I can just say, well, I'm not. I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in souls or whatever. But this is a belief system that masquerades as something that's not a belief system. It masquerades as a human right and a truth about all humans. And you're not allowed to be an atheist, gender atheist, when it comes to this particular belief system. You're not allowed to say, I hear you when you say you think you're a woman. I believe that you think that you're a woman. I can see that you're a man, and I'm not going to pretend that you're a woman. And moreover, I think it's quite regressive to think that feelings of being a woman are what makes somebody a woman. I think what makes somebody a woman is just being female, that's all. And there's no behavioural or opinion criterion for being a woman. So that's the problem in a nutshell. It's that it's a belief system, an ideology that is based on nothing and that is being forced down everybody's throats. We're all meant to go along with it. And when we have to do that, we don't just lose our freedom of belief and our freedom of speech. We lose the rights to single-sex spaces because they become single gender identity spaces, which means they become mixed-sex spaces. And everybody wants single-sex spaces in some circumstances. Well, I can't say everybody. There are people who don't anymore. Both men and women, I meant, need single-sex spaces in some circumstances, but women really need them. So it's particularly harmful for women. I hope that was not too long and covered the ground.
And it's beautiful, it's brilliant. It was interesting, while you were talking about that, I was thinking about many of the conversations I've had with people who are essentially on the other side of the argument. And one conversation in mind was someone who's sort of well versed in all the literature, and said it just wasn't a problem for men to come into women's spaces, particularly changing rooms. What would you say to those people? Because a lot of people I know probably will have a lot of difficulty with the conversation we're having. So what would you say to those people?
Is that person saying that there's no problem in general with men coming in, or are they saying that men who identify as women aren't a problem?
I think probably both, if you ask them.
Okay.
Yeah, but go with the second one. Men who identify as women.
Yeah, I think I'll sort of go with both, because for me it's the same argument, but it's important to say that for other people it isn't the same argument. So if you start from the position that we just are ineluctably male and female, and there's just nothing we can do about that, no matter how much we want to do about it, which is the position I take. And I don't think it's an unkind position any more than I think reality is unkind. Like, it's not me who's saying that, it's reality that's saying that, it's biology that says that, evolution says that. Then you have to think, like, what are single-sex spaces for? Why do we not just have everything mixed sex? Because we don't segregate by race now. We used to. So some people will say, you're a racist or the equivalent of a racist if you say that you don't want men in women's spaces. But race and sex are very different things, and that is acknowledged in equality laws around the world. There are lots of places, I should say, where it's acceptable to discriminate by sex, but not acceptable to discriminate by race, and changing rooms is one of them. So you certainly couldn't set up a changing room here in the UK, where I am, that was for white people only, and rightly so. There's no salient difference between white and black people when it comes to changing rooms. There is a salient difference between male and female people when it comes to changing rooms, however, and it is expressly lawful to segregate for changing rooms when it comes to male and female. So what are those differences? Well, little biology lesson, which absolutely everybody knows is true, but lots of people are now pretending is not true. Men are bigger than women, and they're much stronger. Much, much stronger, much more than people realise. Most of us have fortunately not been hit by somebody of the opposite sex. We haven't entered into physical altercations. Most men have never been hit by a woman, and unfortunately a lot of women have been hit by men, but I haven't. So it's easy to pretend, if you're one of the privileged people who has not been beaten up by a husband or somebody like that, that really we're quite equal physically, but we're not. So men are much stronger than women, and the strength is differentially biggest in the upper body and in the bits of you that are to do with punching and overpowering and throttling and such like. Most men are able to beat a woman until she's down and she's not able to get up. Most women The overlap is very small. Very, very few women will be able to do that to men. So we separate men and women in places where women are vulnerable because men also commit nearly all the sex crimes. So a man is both able to overpower a woman and commits certain sorts of crimes that are facilitated by access to vulnerable spaces, places where women are naked, undressed, sleeping, unable to get away, like prison, ill, like hospital wards. And we do that as a major risk reduction measure for women. And even if men don't do anything bad when they're in those spaces, many, many women, indeed most, just don't want to be seen naked or semi-undressed by people of the opposite sex in situations where they're happy with people of the same sex. They want their intimate care to be from another woman. They don't want to go into changing rooms, even with a well-behaved man who's taking off his clothes. They don't want to see his body. They regard it as indecent exposure to see a man, and they regard the man seeing them as voyeurism. Even if that man doesn't feel like that, even if that man thinks that he's a good person, he shouldn't be there. He's in the wrong place. So somebody who thinks that there are men who are really women will have listened to all of that and may have agreed with all of it, but think it doesn't apply to trans women. But to me, a trans woman is just a man who says he's a woman. So he's no different than other men. He doesn't belong in women's spaces. And if you think what it feels like to be other women in the space, like how are we to know what this man's beliefs about himself are? He's clearly male. He's as male as anybody else. Obviously, trivially, a man can just lie and say he identifies as a woman. Like if you allow in any man, even the totally sincere ones who insist that they really are women, you can't keep out any man because there's no way of other people knowing which men are sincere and which ones aren't. So that's the reason why we need those spaces for women's safety, dignity, privacy, for risk reduction. And there's no difference between the men who identify as women and all the other men. For the other users, I accept that there may be for those men, of course. But I'm thinking about the other users, the people that these spaces were set up for. These spaces weren't set up to protect men who identify as women. They were set up to protect women. And we're half the population, so I don't feel that we should be at all apologetic about saying what we need. How could I convince somebody who really thinks it's possible for a man to be a woman? It's very difficult once someone has bought into that idea. I suppose I could say, well, how are other people meant to know? You know, if a man tells me he identifies as a woman, it doesn't make me feel any better about him being naked in front of me, or me having to be naked in front of him. I might say there's very few of them, and more than 50% of the population is female, and you know we do have to think about numbers sometimes. I might say, well, if we let in the men who really, really somehow are women, we can't keep out the men who really aren't. Sometimes people say then, well, you're punishing a small minority for the behaviour of the big majority, namely the men, like, you know, men, as in men who identify as men commit nearly all the sex crime. That's true. That's because most men are men who identify as men, not men who identify as women. Sometimes they think that men who identify as women are lower risk than other men. And that's false. We know that from the statistics. The one really good study, because it was very complete, was a Swedish one, which was an entire population study of every man who had got himself right through sex reassignment surgery, which is the genital surgery, removes your genitals, and had gone through legal sex change as well. A study tracking them through the rest of their lives showed that their patterns of crime were the same as all men's. There was no difference. And the differences are so large between men and women when it comes to criminality. Like men commit, 98, 99% of all sex crimes. And there are generally 20 times as many men in prison as there are women in developed countries. And even on top of that enormous difference in numbers, the men are far more likely to have committed violent and sex crimes. So, at any one point, there's just a few dozen or 100 or something like that women in prison in the whole of the UK for a sex crime. And there's maybe 20,000 men. And when you remember how underreported crimes like rape and sexual abuse and child abuse are overwhelmingly committed by men, which we know from victimization studies, if anyone wants to know, you realize that there's just an overwhelming difference. So men who identify as women are in the man group when it comes to risk, not in the woman group. So when you admit them into women's spaces, you're enormously increasing the risk for all the women in that group. And that's not me saying that trans women are perverts or something. I'm just saying they're men, that's all. I don't think all men are perverts. I just think that most of the sex criminals are men. That's all. I've tried this many times, and people, if they're very determined to believe that my reason is bigoted, they stick with it. But that's the best I can do.
Yeah. It's also, I see it as, it just creates a honeypot for nefarious men. If you were a sexual offender, all you have to do is pretend to be a woman, and then you're in a woman's changing shoes.
So we know that from anywhere that you have a sacred caste of men. I mean, I'm Irish. I hope my accent hasn't vanished so much that people in New Zealand can't tell, but sometimes
we can tell. We love it.
Okay, I've lived in England for so long that people sometimes think I'm from the West Country or something like that. There's some similarities. You know, I knew a lot of priests who were wonderful people. Like when I think back to the parish priest in the parish that I was in as a child and teenager, he was one of the best people I've ever known. A good man who gave up his life in service to other human beings. So I'm not anti-clerisy. But the fact is you weren't allowed to question priests in Catholic Ireland of my childhood and young adulthood. And so, of course, men who were paedophiles did find their way into the priesthood. And when they behaved the way they did, nobody reported it because they knew they wouldn't get listened to, and they knew that they would get told that they were bringing disrepute on the church. A relative of mine, a much older relative, went into the priesthood and he actually left before he was ordained. The unpleasant term that was used for men like that when I was a child was they were spoilt priests. So he was a spoilt priest, wonderful man, went on into teaching and did a great deal of good. And what he said was that the cardinal rule that they had to stick to was never bring trouble to the church. I forget the exact phrase. Don't bring disrepute to the church. So keep your dirty laundry to yourself. And in situations like that, bad people take advantage. And we've seen that in Boy Scouts as well, because people, naively thought everybody who's a scout leader is a very good person who loves children. And of course, most of them are. That's why they're doing it. Dead easy for paedophiles to come in. Boarding school teachers, children's TV presenters, children's entertainers, all these places give you access to children. And until we all became much more aware of child sex abuse, a cloak behind which you could hide. So if you say that men who identify as women can come into women's spaces freely, as you say, you're going to get bad actors. You just are. And I'm just not willing to sacrifice women on that basis, even if it's really hard for the sincere men who identify as women.
Yeah.
We've got to find another answer for them. And they're my secondary concern after the majority of humanity that is female, and to experience most of the sexual crime and commit almost none of it.
Yeah. The other thing is, I always think if a member of a family was sexually molested in a changing room by a man, their opinion would probably change quite dramatically.
My husband says that too. Yeah. And I wonder.
Right.
I mean, some people are so far down the rabbit hole that they see nothing.
Yeah.
And also, there were people who knew very well that a member of their family had been abused by a priest, but what could they do about it? The priest was the sacred caste, literally.
Yeah. Yeah. In your preamble, I was thinking, one of the question I was going to ask that I didn't was essentially you're saying that trans ideology is a new religion, and
I think it is. It's a godless neo-religion.
Yeah, and what you're saying is trans men in particular are a sacred class, which you can't question.
Yeah, so the terminology is always dreadfully confusing. You and I are using man and woman to mean sex-based terms.
Yes.
So men who identify as women in their terminology are trans women, which is one of the reasons they've managed to get so far. The language is so confusing and difficult to keep track of. There was a very interesting poll in the UK some months ago, commissioned by Murray Blackburn Mackenzie, who were a brilliant policy house of 3 amazing women in Scotland. And they asked questions about what people understood the words trans woman and transgender woman to mean. And they tried to compromise or, find formulations that everybody understood. So registered at birth was what they said for sex, if I remember correctly, or recorded at birth. And they said, is a trans woman somebody who was recorded male at birth, female at birth? Don't know. And what they found is 1/6 of the UK population thought that a trans woman was someone who's recorded female at birth. And another 6 said they didn't know. And I can tell you that among the rest of them who correctly identified that a trans woman is someone who's born male at birth, what you find is that in a conversation, they may, when their brain is switched on, get that right at the beginning, but then they get confused later down the line. So there was a very, very funny, a terrible but funny piece of research out from a hospital, I think, a hospital trust in Brighton here. And Brighton's like San Francisco, it's the epicenter of this stuff in the UK. And they were talking about pregnancy and trans people. And of course, only trans men can get pregnant because they're women. And then at some point, the poor sod who was writing this bullshit got very, very confused and said very few trans women have ever given birth. Now, no trans woman, literally zero, ever has given birth.
Well, he wasn't too far wrong.
But this person writing this ideological document who knew the terminology got lost.
Yeah.
So people really get lost. And I think that that is part of the reason that there has been so little resistance, is people don't know what they're being asked. So I think a lot of the people who say, yes, of course, trans women are women, think that the slogan is saying trans women are women who identify as men. And then why would you keep them out of the women's changing rooms? They're women. Like, people understand that they're vulnerable the same way that all other women are.
Yeah.
Probably extra vulnerable as well, because they maybe make risky choices. So, yeah, I just had to say that for your readers, or your listeners. This is, you really have to keep your head around you. That's why I say man who identifies as woman. A lot of road testing, people understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the language is Orwellian. Orwell got a lot of things right. And there's inversions, basically. Man means woman, woman means man, which is very confusing.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's something I'm a real pedant about definitions, and so I find this rather irritating and concerning.
But the law has to be pedantic about it.
Well, the law does, yes, but even in just normal dialogue and conversation, we do have to. We have to know what each other means. Yeah, and so
yes, exactly. It's not a language if you don't.
Exactly, and in a way, I'll run this past you. It's sort of like the political correctness that has creeped in over my lifetime. I mean, I've always been concerned. Of course, there are some situations where it is good, but it's this sort of dictate upon high that language should change rather than it evolving as language normally does from grassroots and bottom up. So what would your comments be? I mean, we sort of touched on it, but if you can talk about it more broadly, about how the trans ideology movement has used language as essentially, in a sense, a Trojan horse to get their ideology past people and to fully convince people. Yeah.
I think that's the effect, but I don't think they're quite that cynical. I think that they're people who do believe that language creates reality.
Yes.
And that's got a fairly long history at this point in postmodernist thinking. It sort of started from, if you go back to 19th century scientists, the Victorian men, roughly, who, many advances, evolution, the theory of evolution and so on, these were people who believed that there was a reality out there and that their job was to see reality as clearly as possible. And, I more and more think that even if that's not completely true, it's the most productive way to think about things when you're trying to create policy or do science. But the thing is, it's not actually completely true. We are just inescapably creatures who have viewpoints and who see only partially and who bring our biases in to what we do. I mean, even just on the we see only partially fronts, our eyes only see a small amount of electromagnetic radiation. We're a certain size, so we don't see relativity and we don't see quantum mechanics. These are really very different than this size physics. They're three very different sorts of physics. So, we really only see part of what's there, a little bit of what's there. And the more you learn about the way that the eye works and the ear works, you realize that we are in our brains creating a great deal of what we see and what we hear. And that's a kind of seductive idea when you discover it first, because it feels very clever. And you think wow, everything's happening in the brain and not out there. Out there is just a formless, amorphous mass of stuff, and we create reality in our brains. And again, I say a lot of that is true, but not all of it. And then you start to think much more trivial and tertiary order things it matters whether you're male or female as an observer, it matters whether you're black or white. And again, there's truth to that. Like, the fact is that medicine and science really overlooked things that are specific to women. Like, women's medical research is much poorer than men's medical research. Things were done to black people that would not have been done to white people. Descriptions of sort of the normal person in a group tend to be a white person. Like, all of this is true. And so there was a lot of value to people making these points when they made them first and trying to make science better at going, like, are we considering women as well as men? Are we considering people of different races? Or are we imagining that the norm for this blood sugar test or whatever is basically Caucasian, etc., etc. Anyway, it all went too far, as things often do, and it got to the point where you create reality really yourself entirely. And then, that became to seem moral, because the thing is, once you're creating reality with words, you can make reality be whatever you want. And so why would you not make it utopia? Why would you not make it so that men and women are really equal in all respects? I don't mean equal in value, I mean really actually equal. So we're as strong as men, for example. Sometimes I say, women are much weaker than men physically, and therefore we need our own sports. I tweeted something about that recently, and some idiot underneath said, all the brilliant sportswomen would find that deeply insulting. Well, I happen to be from a very sporty family. I'm the one non-sporty person out of my large number of siblings. I have 5 siblings who were captain cricket for Ireland, and 2 sisters who played on the Ireland team, one of whom captained it for many years. She played in Australia for a long time. I'm half the year and half the year in Ireland, in Tasmania, if I remember correctly. So people may know her, Isabel Joyce. I know you're in New Zealand,
Thank
but
you.
anyway, I regard you're that side of the world. So of course she knows she's physically weaker than men, for goodness sake. Like, she's been playing against boys and men all her life. Like, when she was captaining Ireland, she was playing on a seconds and thirds and occasionally firsts club side for men to get enough practice with strong people and fast balls. She's well aware of the fact that she wouldn't be a professional cricketer if she had to be in with the men. She's just, she's the best Irish female cricketer who's ever been, but she was at her very best on a men's club side. So, yes, there's an enormous difference. Does this mean that she's inferior to them? No. It just means that her body evolved to do a set of things that men don't have to do, namely get pregnant, give birth, and breastfeed. And that's an enormous, enormous burden on a human body that men's bodies don't have to. So, of course, you can do more things. Like, sorry, I rant about this because it annoys me so much, because it's such a trivial point that the other side is making, like, you think women aren't great. Like, we make all new life.
Yeah.
We live for years longer. We're less susceptible to infection. We have better self-control of our emotions, in particular the anger ones. There's a bunch of great things about being female, even in the body, that men don't have. And yet, because men are stronger, they're like, oh, you think men are superior. Well, you try giving birth then. And it's, the men who say, well, why don't women try harder? Why don't they train harder? Well, why don't you try harder to get pregnant? Even if you made 2 sexes, they're different things.
Yeah.
Right, rant over.
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I love
Thank
it.
you for giving me time
I love
for
it.
that
Just
one.
while we're on that, I think, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but, Serena Williams, the greatest female tennis player that's ever lived, I think, she was beaten by a male who was ranked 270th. So that's...
Yeah, it was 200 and something, definitely. But it was more than that. Yeah. It was more than that. What happened was, I think it was nearer to 200, like 206 or something like that. But it was definitely between 200 and 300. She made the point that the greatest female tennis player of all time, and really remarkably strong. Like, that's an unusually strong body. If you look at her, she's in the loveliest sense, she's a freak of nature. That's the point about being the very best ever. You're always a freak of nature. Like Simone Biles, like, so tiny and so strong, like absolute outliers. So she's a huge outlier. And she said, but I'd be beaten by, the top several hundred men. Yeah. So this guy did the challenge. But what he did was he played a round of golf in the morning. He went for a couple of pints for lunch. And then he did 2 sets, one against Serena and once against her sister Venus, so that they were fresh. They did 1 set each, and he beat them from memory 6-love, 6-1. Yeah. So it's just the upper body strength. Yeah. Like, if you look at men and women's tennis, they're very different games. I mean, actually, the women's tennis is better, in my opinion, because the men's has too many aces. Like, women just can't get as many aces because that upper body strength. I spent ages learning about this for my book. If you think of what happens when you serve in tennis, you're recruiting a lot of your upper body. you're using your hand, your arm, your shoulder, your chest, your back, and all of those are about 50% stronger in men than they are in women. So you're compounding all these many differences, and you can just whack the ball, and men who are training will practice aces for months and years, and then they will win by getting aces because it's so fast. They can get the ball so fast, the other man just can't get to it. It's beyond human ability to move that fast. Women just can't do that, so women have much more volleys, rallies. And so it's a different game, a more interesting game in my opinion, but that's how he won.
Yeah.
Whack.
So a good follow-on to that is what, Helen, is the problem with men competing in women's sports? What could possibly be wrong with that?
Well, you have to think, like, what is sport? Because it always annoys me when people do these very grand questions, like, what is sport anyway? But like, sport isn't just a hobby. If it isn't fair, it isn't sport, is one of the things they say in philosophy of sport.
Right.
And once you start to think about what fairness is, it's very difficult to get a hold of it, because it's obviously not fair that one person, for example, the Williams, has a parent who's wealthy enough and trained enough to train them from little, and another person doesn't. It's not fair that some countries are bigger than others, and so it's easier for them to win medals. Well, it's not fair that some countries are richer than others.
Nothing's fair. That's the reality.
Nothing's fair. Well, so what we do in sport is we have categories which identify things which we regard as unfair if they were to be directly in competition with each other. An obvious one would be Paralympians. So the Paralympics category, either you say that sport is only for able-bodied people, or you have a separate category for people who are not able-bodied. It's not fair that somebody's disabled. But, do we have to compound that unfairness by having it so that they can't play sport? Obviously not. And then it would be grossly unfair for somebody who's able-bodied to compete in the Paralympic category, because they're bringing an advantage that's specifically categorically outside that category. So we have several categories. The usual ones are age, disability, and sex, because they're very large ones, and they're largish groups of people, and the advantage of being in the prime category in each of those, being able-bodied, being prime age, being male, is so large that if we didn't categorize by that, the other group wouldn't actually ever get into the competition, let alone on the podium. And on age, you would have no under 18s if adults could compete in it. You would have no over 35s if under 35s could compete in it. So we separate things, and then once you have a separate category, bringing the categorical advantage into the disadvantaged group is unfair. It is just unfair. It's like having an outboard motor on your bike in a cycling competition. I'm so shit a cyclist, but I'd still lose, even with an outboard motor. It's still unfair. I'd be faster than I would be without it. That is not allowed in cycling. We do not have motors in cycling. End of story. And then we accept that some cyclists have a better body, they have a better bike, they've got better training, whatever. Those are the sources of unfairness that mean that everybody doesn't finish at the same time. If we went through and we said there were to be no sources of unfairness, what we'd be saying is all human beings would enter the finish line at the same moment. There would never be any competition. So competitions in sport are about identifying the people who have the natural advantages, the training, the skill, the drive, the physique, all of those things, but not the ones that are categorical. And if you allow someone to move category, then that tends to override all the others. So I said that Serena Williams was, in the most beautiful sense, a freak of nature. She is. But if we had mixed sex tennis, as in just one category, we'd never have heard of her, because she's the most perfect female human being for playing tennis imaginable, but much more ordinary men can beat her. So if you want to identify female brilliance, ability, exceptional performance, and so on, you have to have a female category. Same with Paralympians. You're never going to know about the amazing Paralympian athletes if there's no Paralympics category. You're never going to see the world's best under 18 anything if there's no child category. So you're just not allowed to move category if you're going from the privileged category to the unprivileged category. You're allowed the other way, by the way. So, if there was somebody who was, like I said, my sister was always playing in men's games. I mean, she's bringing her major female disadvantage into men's category. That's generally regarded as fair. I think there are some places that you wouldn't like boxing because it's too dangerous.
You get killed.
Actually, boxing is an interesting one to bring up.
Yeah.
Along with weightlifting, they have weight categories. And that is because no matter how brilliant a man is, if he's small, he can't box against a big man. He'll just lose. He might be a much, much better boxer, much faster on his feet, much nippier, much more skilled, but he'll just get a fist to the face and he'll be gone. So we have weight categories in that. We don't have to have. We could just say, oh, well, boxing just identifies the enormously freakish, big, good boxers, the same way that basketball doesn't have height categories. And so basically there's almost nobody small in basketball. But you absolutely could introduce a height category in basketball. The reason they don't is because small people who would be very, very good at basketball are probably very good at some other sports as well, because they're fast, they're skilled, they've got a good hand-eye coordination, etc. So they just play something else. Like, there's sports for everybody. If you're a huge, beefy guy, you go into weightlifting, boxing, American football. If you're very tall, you go into basketball, da-da-da. But if you said that men and women had to compete together, in all of those, it would be men. So a woman can't say, well, I've got a woman's physique, and so that means I go into these sports. No, the men will be better at those too, because they're stronger, more endurance, more endurance except at very, very long distances, more response to training, basically everything. Better biomechanics. Men's biomechanics are much better than women's for movement, because women have to get a baby out, like this extra task that evolution had to answer. The way that the force goes down through the legs when you're walking, running, jumping, etc., is more efficient for men. Men have more efficient tendons and muscles. They're tighter and more elastic, so you bounce more with the same force. There's a lot of differences between men and women under the hood, more than the obvious ones.
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing about sports, why we watch sports, is the uncertainty. And it's uncertain because the range, the differential range, is actually quite close. Now, if we keep on allowing men to compete in women's sport is, apart from anything, just going to become incredibly boring, because the men should win all the time.
So sometimes people say, well, case by case then. There's this campaigner here, a chap called Peter Tatchell, who was a gay rights advocate and is now basically a trans rights advocate, although he would say LGBT. He's an incredibly frustrating person to talk to, because you explain to him with chapter and verse why what he's saying is wrong, and then the next time you see him, he just says it again. So one of his ones is that some trans women are small and weak. So he says he gives a particular example of some trans woman he knows who plays in women's football. I don't think professionally, but I'm not sure. I really don't think professionally. But women's sport isn't a sort of second chance for weak men.
Yeah.
The fact is that's just not a very good man. Like, we don't go, oh, well, this able-bodied person is fat and old and unfit and they're not bothering to train, so let's let them into the Paralympics, where they might actually beat somebody who should be in the Paralympics, but who's been training all the time. So, yeah, I just want to say that, because people sometimes think, that the ranges do overlap a bit for men and women. We're not going to let in the shittest men into women's sports, where they can be much, much better there than they were as men.
Yeah.
Because it's just totally unfair on women who are actually exceptional.
Yeah.
Women's sports is about identifying and rewarding female exceptional performance. It's not about rewarding mundane, ordinary, unexceptional men.
Yeah. Now, the two topics I really want to get covered in this podcast is education. What are we teaching to our children about this?
I mean, I don't know the chapter and verse of your syllabus in New Zealand, but I bet you it's as rubbish as the one here. I mean, something went wrong about 50 years ago in education, where we stopped thinking that the point of teachers was to be in loco parentis in school during the day. That is, that we understand that parents are the people who have primary responsibility for their children, for their safety, their education, their upbringing, and also that they were there to change the world rather than to teach stuff, skills and information. And so that's taken as a given by most teachers now, that their job is to form the next generation in a way that is what they regard as good. I don't like the phrase social justice warrior, because I think it's overused, but that's what they see themselves as, in the most literal sense, that they are creating utopia in the next generation, rather than I've got a range of people in front of me. Some of them are from conservative families, some of them are from liberal ones, some are religious, some aren't. They're from all over the place. My job is to make sure that all the kids in front of me are as good at maths as they can be, or, have learned how to be fine, upstanding citizens who can go on and have a productive life, a productive and happy life, ideally. So basically, once you make that switch, what you decide about in your syllabus loses all connection with objective reality because of this idea that you can remake the world linguistically. So you teach children flat lies because they believe them. Children believe what adults tell them. Like, children believe in Santa Claus without question until they're a certain age. If you tell little children that what makes boys and girls is what they wear and what they play with, then they will believe that, and some of them will continue to believe it into adulthood, I would guess. But in particular, some of them will look at themselves and think, well, what I like is pink and Barbie and shopping and gossiping, and I love the idea of wearing jewellery and makeup when I'm a little bit older. I must be a girl. And other ones will think, I don't like any of that, and frankly, I like being out in the mud and climbing and, getting into fistfights, so I must be a boy. But those kids are the ones. They're a minority. Most girls are quite feminine and most boys are quite masculine. Like, play and behaviour and preferences for clothing and so on are actually quite, fitted with the stereotypes, but there's overlap. And nobody's entirely masculine or feminine in that way. I mean, I like mathematics. I'll be an ordinarily feminine woman in many ways, but I have a PhD in mathematics. So everybody's like that. Everybody's a mixture. But if you tell people that what makes them, if you tell little boys, I should say, and little girls, that what makes them boys and girls is how well they fit with stereotypes, the kids who will get confused most are the ones who are destined to grow up gay, the ones who are autistic and therefore very, very black and white thinkers. As they head towards puberty, what you'll get is the ones who are most terrified by the changes that puberty brings. That's the ones who've been really scared by porn that they've seen, and porn is almost ubiquitous now in schools because of the mobile phone. You'll get the ones who've been abused, and because girls in particular want to identify out of their bodies, if they think those bodies have been what brought on the abuse. You'll get the ones who start developing early. Because a girl of 9 or 10 who grows breasts is going to get wolf whistled on the street, and she's not remotely mentally up for it, prepared for it. Yeah, so that's what's happening. They're telling children that sex isn't important, that it's bigoted to notice people's sex and to think it's real, that sex is a spectrum, that gender identity is real, innate, everybody knows theirs, it's important that you know what yours is, that your gender identity is what makes you a boy or a girl, that it's very, very brave and wonderful to be trans, but also the same as being cis, which is the opposite of trans, like not being trans is cis, like that it's bad to think that one is better than the other. But actually identifying as trans is identifying with a lie, with a falsehood. And it's identifying in a way that will set you up to be at conflict with other people and in conflict with your own body for the rest of your life. So it's obviously inferior. And it may put you on a medicalized pathway as well. So, we should regard that to the extent that we cannot stop them from identifying as trans. Those people we need to accommodate as well as we can and as kindly as we can. But I mean, it's obviously an inferior outcome to working out what sex you are and identifying with it. That's the ideal outcome. So yeah, we're ruining a generation of kids, I think, in many ways to do with mental health, but this is a serious one of them.
Yeah. And in the extreme, you can get what I see as rather horrific medical interventions. I mean, one I heard of is a 13-year-old getting a double mastectomy.
Yeah, we've just had a report here from Dr.
Yes,
Cass.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah. Strangely enough.
Yeah. Well, so when we're recording, it's is it a week? It's a week since it came out now as we're recording. So Dr. Hilary Cass is a very eminent paediatrician. She's a former president of the Royal Society for Paediatrics here in the UK, very widely respected, sort of towards the end of her career. She has spent the last 4 years doing a government-commissioned study into specifically paediatric gender medicine. So her remit is in the NHS, the National Health Service, but that's nearly everything here in the way of healthcare. It's the gender services, so not schools or what GPs, family doctors are doing. It's really that, like the specialist clinics. But her report is magisterial. She commissioned a very large and very high quality literature review and study of all the guidelines around the world, like the formalized guidelines. And what she concluded was that they're nearly all terrible. So the big ones from WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which isn't world, it's mostly American. It's not professional. Anyone can join. You just pay $200, and it's not about healthcare.
Again, Orwellian inversions.
Yeah. It sounds great, but it's just you pay $200 and you can join, and 75% of the members are American, and it has the most lunatic standards of care imaginable, and they aren't standards of care. Standards of care is a proper term in medicine. It means you've gone through a certain process, which is very evidence-driven. They just said what they thought should happen. Like there's an entire chapter on eunuch gender identity. It says little boys can be born eunuchs, and what you should do is cut their genitals off. An entire chapter on non-binary. No mention of lower age limits for anything. What else is completely insane in it? They took out an ethics chapter that they started writing. So, I mean, like, when I say it's bad, I mean it's as bad as it's possible to be. Anyway, she knocked that down. So what she concluded is that if you look at the evidence, there's literally no evidence supporting the use of puberty blockers for gender distress in childhood.
Yeah.
All of this has been horribly misreported in many places in the past week, so I'm going to try and knock down a few of the misinformation.
It would be good, because I think in a week's time, the Ministry of Education here is going to make an announcement on puberty blockers. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that a literature review does, like the one she commissioned people at the University of York, is it sets criteria beforehand, that it has to cover these things, that it has to be in English, for example, is the usual common one. And then you identify all of them. And all of this is to stop bias, whereby you let weak things in because they fit what you wanted to conclude, or that you exclude strong things that don't fit with your preconceptions, So you set everything in advance. So the review identified 102 studies by doing that. 2 were of the highest quality, 50 were of medium quality, and 50 were low quality. Now, lots of things that are good studies, when they say medium quality, it may just be that they're a bit small.
Right.
Or it may be that, the very best ones have randomly chosen groups, but it may just not be possible to choose a random group as a control. So, it's fine to be a medium study. And the point of these reviews is to collect them. So 50 medium studies that all pointed the same way would actually give you quite a strong conclusion. Right? So you use 52 studies she used, and you weight your strong more than you weight your medium. You drop the weak, because those are they're more likely than not to mislead you. So they looked at those 52 studies, and they found literally no evidence supporting the idea that puberty blockers were helpful for childhood gender distress. And so that got reported as 2 studies she used, and she threw out the other 100. That's flatly false. But also that, we just don't know, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Now, what puberty blockers do is they're like putting you directly into immediate menopause. They cut out that particular hormonal loop entirely. So a child remains in a state of arrested development. The child does not go into puberty, but they continue to age. Their cohort go into puberty. They continue to get taller, but they don't have the enormous brain reshaping that happens in puberty. Like anyone listening to this who's watched somebody go through puberty, you will know that it's an extraordinary process. Like you feel like you're watching a fast forward sometimes. You wake up and your son's an inch taller, And it's how you grow up. It's how you stop being a child and become an adult. So interfering with that is already something that you would do in only the most extreme circumstances. And then when you look at what it does physically, it's clearly bad for your bones, because in your bones you put down the calcium that is going to last you through the rest of your life, especially if you're female. It's clearly bad for your brain. As I say, there's an enormous brain spurt during puberty. But it also keeps your genitals and your gonads, that's your testes and your ovaries, in a state of childhood. It also keeps your sexual response in a state of childhood as well. So if you were destined to grow up gay, you will genuinely find that out early in puberty, because you'll start to get a sexual response to people of your sex. You will not find that out. And you will not start to become orgasmic. So what we do know now about puberty blockers is, on top of all of that, most people who take puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. So they're sometimes sold as a pause button so that you can wait until you're old enough to decide, but actually they lock you in.
Essentially a gateway drug.
Yeah, there's a phrase in medicine, the cascade of intervention. So any woman who has been told in a maternity, like pregnancy and maternity class, that if she has an epidural, she's more likely to have a cesarean, that's a cascade of intervention. So puberty blockers almost 100% leads on to the cross-sex hormones. If you start on puberty blockers around 12 or 13, and then you go on to cross-sex hormones, you will continue to have a child's genitals, a little boy penis. Your testes and your ovaries will not mature, so you will not start producing sperm. You will not be able to have orgasm, and you will not know what your sexuality is. And yet that's what we're doing. So why would you ever do something like this to a child? Would you do it if the evidence was, we don't know if it's going to make you feel better. We don't know if it's going to help what you came in with, namely gender distress. You would do that. I can only think of one situation where you would do that, and that is if the child would die otherwise.
Sorry, say that again? Say that again?
If the child would die otherwise.
Yes.
That is the logic of giving children chemotherapy and radiotherapy for otherwise fatal childhood cancers. Yep. The child is going to die, or they're going to grow up sterile. Okay, we'll go for sterile. Now we've got don't know if this will help, might not. You're going to grow up sterile. Oh, and by the way, your bones and your brain. So
100% of people who go on puberty blockers become sterile?
I think it's like 95 to 100. There's no global figures, but it's really near 100%.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Just a minor thing, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
I mean, you'll never have children. If you
start puberty blockers,
you'll never be a sexual entity.
Yeah, you will be neutered. You're being neutered.
Yeah.
Now that's if you started early. Like if you start puberty blockers at 15, you've done a lot of your development. I still think they're very bad drugs, but I'm just saying, that pathway is the block puberty. And the reason for blocking puberty is mostly in boys. The reason they do it, and they don't say this, they say pause button, they say life-saving. What the real reason is that boys who go through puberty are not going to pass as women as adults. Because puberty for boys does a whole load of things that basically turn you into very visibly not a woman that we can't undo. Facial hair, broader shoulders, hairline, voice breaking is a big one. The other way round, I mean, of course, women develop in a way that doesn't look like men, but you can take testosterone as an adult and you'll start to grow a beard. Your voice will break, So women who identify as men generally pass much, much better than men who identify as women.
Right.
So adult men who identify as women, it is a source of great sorrow to them that they don't pass. And some of them become very fixated on it. They transitioned in their 40s or 50s, often after being married, having kids, enjoying a healthy sex life, all of those things. These men are commonly erotic cross-dressers. Yeah. And the erotic fixation on dressing as a woman to masturbate, to get sexual pleasure, that becomes a fixation for them. And over time, that fixation grows and grows, and they become convinced that the one source of sorrow in their life is that they won't pass. And they project that onto children.
Right.
They look at little boys who have gender distress and they think, I'll stop him from going through puberty.
That makes sense.
And I think they become very fixated on this. Like if you listen to, I wouldn't normally bring up personal individuals, but this isn't a private individual. It's Rachel Levine, who is very senior in the American Federal Administration, Assistant Secretary of Health, who is a man who identifies as a woman. I mean, he just looks like a man with long hair wearing the women's uniform, not the men's. And he sounds like that too. He calls himself a lesbian as far as I know because he's a straight man. But that man, more than anyone else I've ever heard, gives speeches talking about how puberty blockers are life-saving care, how important it is for little boys to have access to this. And I'm like, you didn't sacrifice your genitals and your sex life and your brain health and your bone health and all of those things. And so why could you possibly want those things to be taken from minors? And I think it must be because he's so unhappy himself about not passing that he projects that onto children. So the real reason that these drugs are used is because there are adult men who are trying to live vicariously and trying to make right what they think is the thing that made them most unhappy. I don't think it is the thing that made them most unhappy. I think we can get fixated. I think they've become fixated and they blame everything on the fact that they don't pass.
Yeah, well, what you've just described is nothing short of extreme child abuse.
Yes, I think it is too. I completely do. These drugs shouldn't be used. I do understand, although I don't agree with, the early gender doctors who try it. I did talk to three actually, very principled Canadian doctors who have supported this pathway back in the 1990s and 2000s, but they were imagining incredibly carefully gate-kept. I don't think you can gatekeep. I'm just trying to say what they were imagining. Incredibly gate-kept systems where hardly anybody transitioned, where you only would consider doing this to children who had been like so distressed that they were trying to cut their own genitals off when they were 3, you know? And you could imagine that maybe this child is somebody who'd be better off. Now, you need the studies to find out whether they really would be, and what Cass showed is, no, they aren't. You know, it's a question. If you could identify these people, and if you do this thing, maybe they will be better off. She answered, there's no reason to say that. And in particular, one place where she didn't just say, we don't know, is the suicide risk. It is categorically incorrect to say that puberty blockers make suicide less likely in children with gender dysphoria. We know that's false. That's answered. But that's the only thing that you could put on the scales to balance the enormous.
I have been given that argument.
Yeah. Well, the jury is in. We have the data. It's not true.
Yeah.
Children with gender dysphoria are a little bit more likely than other children to, sadly, to commit suicide or to attempt suicide. But that is because there are a lot of comorbidities. These are children who very commonly are depressed, anxious, eating disorders, etc., etc. So when you compare them with children who have the same other diagnoses, all the difference disappears.
Yeah.
And puberty blockers don't help anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, that is all very depressing stuff.
It is a medical scandal. It is a huge medical scandal.
Yes, and I was listening to a podcast the other day about the history of medical scandals. So it's in the long line, with lobotomies and I can't remember what the other.
Yeah, people say, how could this happen? But it happens all the time.
Well, that's my favourite quote is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So yeah, we're not special. We're not immune to these social contagions. Now,
I often think what happened to the people who said that lobotomies were a bad idea, because it's so obviously a bad idea to stick something in the eye socket and wiggle it around in the brain. But there must have been, in fact, I know there were people. There was a sort of travelling circus in America. The guy it wasn't the guy who invented the lobotomy, he was Portuguese. The guy who popularised it was the guy who thought of doing it through the eyes, because it could be done very quickly. And he and his team would turn up at hospitals where they would already have sedated about 20 patients. And he would just do them all in the morning with his travelling circus, and other people would clean up afterwards, and off he'd go somewhere else. There were people in those hospitals saying, why are we doing this? Yeah. I bet you they were treated the same way as those of us who were saying that this is a medical scandal. I bet you they were. And then at some point, the outcomes became so clearly bad. There were so many people who were permanently institutionalised and unable to function after lobotomies that the scandal became impossible to ignore. And then you won't find anyone who supports it. Yeah. Except the people who have become complicit. Yeah. The guy who invented them continued to argue for the rest of his life that they were a good thing and that they were just being done on the wrong people. Yeah. We're going to see that again.
Yeah, I completely agree. Freedom of speech.
Do we have any? I mean, we do. We're talking here.
Well, but, have you... Well, one of your podcast you did with, was it Jordan Peterson got pulled down. But, well, we do have freedom of speech, but...
We have limited freedom of speech. We have significant limitations.
Particularly on the subject you're talking about.
Yes. I mean, more generally as well, I don't know if you saw just the night before you and I are talking, a major Conservative conference was shut down in Belgium. NatCon it's called. Now, NatCon would be to the far end of right-wing respectable, but it's definitely in the respectable, as in not illegal, allowed to happen, mainstream and important individuals go. They represent a significant portion of public opinion, very significant. That by definition is the sort of thing that should be allowed to go ahead. You don't silence very large parts of mainstream public opinion. If you do, you end up with Brexit, you end up with increased racism, you end up with a lot of bad things. So it was closed down in the Belgian city by the mayor, saying that it was hateful. He sent in armed police to block the venue and to stop the people going in. And it includes people like Suella Braverman, who is a former minister here, Home Secretary here in the UK. And again, Suella Braverman is well to the right of the political party, of the Conservative Party. She's right there. But, so what? They're the party in power. People voted for them. She's expressing a major mainstream opinion. Anyway, they took out an injunction overnight and went directly to the national level court, which gave them an injunction to stop the same thing happening today. So the second day of the conference is going to go ahead. It is incredible to me that anyone could either think of doing this or think that it is a good idea. It's back to the words are magic. If we stop people from saying there are too many immigrants, political correctness has gone too far, any of those things. These are not my opinions. I'm not saying that. They are significant opinions of large chunks of the population. They are lawful. There should be no impediments to saying them. But people think that if you stop them, then the opinion vanishes, which is the most stupid thinking. This is like, when children play hide and seek and they think that if they cover their eyes, you can't see them. It's that level of stupid.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. I actually started this podcast exactly for that reason. Two people banned by the
we have no freedom of speech on this topic.
Well, I mean, can you actually say that? I mean, we are talking. I mean, I've listened to hundreds of hours of you talking.
So yes, because I don't stop. I mean, as one of the people who dislikes me most, a trans woman called Frida Wallace, who did a debate with me in one of the very rare public things where you have someone putting forward trans bullshit and someone putting forward, the remarkable opinion that there are two sexes. He says, Helen Joyce just says the same thing over and over again in different words. Yes, that's not my fault.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you.
That's just the number there
I'm going to disagree with me. A friend texted me today and she said the great thing about Helen, every time you listen to her, she's got something new to say. So
yeah, but it's always the same thing. It's always there are two sexes. I'm getting very frustrated by this. Well, if we could all just establish that, this problem would be over.
I mean, that's the...
Oh, and that they matter. Sorry, you've got to say the matter bit as well.
Yeah. That's the joy of politics, really. Is you have to say something, the same thing over and over and over again, and then eventually...
I don't find that the joy. There's a reason I'm not a politician. I couldn't stand it.
Well, I'm saying...
But you challenged me. Yeah, you challenged me on the question of whether we have free speech or not. So free speech doesn't mean you are able to speak. It's much more than that. It's that there aren't unreasonable or unfair restrictions on your speech. So, it is a fact that most mainstream media will not listen to me or anyone else who says any of the same things as me and categorize us as hateful. So I have been on the BBC precisely once since I became known to be somebody who... And
can I just butt in there just to give the audience, I'll have this in the intro, but just to remind the audience, you worked for The Economist, which is one of the most mainstream magazines.
17 years. 17 years.
You're an editor. You were the Brazilian correspondent.
Yep, very senior, very, very senior. I was one of the most senior editors of The Economist, and I did not lose my job over this issue. I left because I wanted to campaign on this issue, and they tried very hard to keep me.
So you couldn't, in a sense, you couldn't get more mainstream than Helen Joyce.
Not just mainstream, but like technocratic centrist. Like I belonged to the class who went to Davos. I went to Davos twice when I was finance editor. I was on the BBC all the time.
Right.
I had a list of things I was regarded as suitable to commentate on. So my jobs included education correspondent, Brazil correspondent based in Sao Paulo, international editor, finance editor. I did a job as an executive editor job, which is a more sort of administrative thing. And then I finished as Britain editor. Those are the sorts of things that get you on places like the BBC all the damn time and chairing big conferences and so on. People would invite me to talk about South America, about financial regulation, about British politics. The last job that I did at The Economist, I was writing leaders, editorials the whole time, right through Boris Johnson eating cake and the like. You may have heard that Prime Minister did a lot of cake eating and it got him out of power. So that's who I was. I'm not some random person saying I'm entitled to go on the BBC. I'm somebody who was on the bloody BBC the whole time. Then along comes this issue. That's a big issue. And here I am writing a best-selling book on it. And it's as if I don't exist. And it's not just me. It's all the other people, all the many people. Some of them with CVs that are longer than mine, who've known about these things more, who write in more outlets. So I'm saying this about me because I know my facts, but I'm not the only one by any means. It's everybody on my side. And then they get these total non-entities who have no sensible thing to say on the other side. So the one and only time I've been on the BBC since I came out on this topic was in fact about the Cass Review. So it was the day it came out. I was on the BBC in an early morning slot. There were good people on other bits of the BBC as well. Hilary Cass herself was on the flagship Radio 4 Today programme, so that was brilliant, and she had a good interview on that. The person who was on directly before me, they got an edited quote from a pre-recorded interview with a reality TV contestant who is trans. So a teenage boy who says he's a woman. And he literally said that he knew he was a woman because as a baby, he was photographed in a blonde wig and wearing pink dresses. That was played, and then they go to me to talk about it. That is what they think of as balance on the BBC. And I mean, what journalist listens to somebody say they have pictures of themselves as a baby? A baby, he said the word baby, in a blonde wig. Nobody puts blonde wigs on babies. What is he talking about? This is obvious bullshit. And anyway, what's that got to do with anything?
So why has the media? Because I imagine the same things is in New Zealand. I imagine it's the same. Why has the media got so vapid like this? Because it's not just on this issue.
No, I know. I mean, maybe constrained, so narrowly constrained. Their Overton window is minute. Yeah.
So why is that?
Well, they're very inward looking. You know, media have always, like, the people you care about most in the media are your competitors in other media. Like when I was in Brazil, yes, okay, you want to know what's happening out in Brazil. That's the job. And you want to know what readers think. And you try and make yourself keep focusing on that. But the fact is, you also want to know what the FT's correspondent is writing and what the Wall Street Journal's correspondent is writing. And those are the people that you meet at things. So unless you're careful, you live in a bubble.
Yes.
So I think that the BBC in particular, but a lot of media organisations have allowed themselves to get very insular. Then there's political polarisation. Like more and more, you are writing for only one segment of society. So The Guardian used to, when I was in the 90s, when I was a young woman, I used to read The Guardian. I loved it, even though it wasn't my politics, because they had a very deliberate decision that on any contentious issue, they would find the best voices they could and give you a for and against. That's what the opinion pages were. They were, on very difficult topics like the Middle East, they would find somebody saying what Israel thought and what Palestine, the Palestinian leadership thought. And people would always complain, but that was regarded as a good thing. That meant that you were getting conversations going. And now The Guardian ignores this topic, has never quoted the organisation I work for, did not review my book.
Right.
So I think maybe The Observer reviewed my book, the Sunday version. Maybe they did review it late and said stupid things about it. I can't remember. Anyway, the point is, they are writing only now for the far left.
Yeah. So
America and the UK.
They're not journalists; they're activists who write.
Yes, and they would say that. I've heard that in editorial meetings at The Guardian now, and people will, like, suppose an immigrant kills somebody, and it would be the sort of horrific killing that you might just report if anybody killed somebody in those circumstances, like a senseless attack on the street type thing, which are rare here, luckily. People at The Guardian will say, we won't report that because it gives ammunition to people who don't like immigrants. Yeah. Yes, it does, but it's also true. Journalists aren't meant to censor like that. That's for other people. That's for the activists and it's for the politicians. Our job is it news? Report it as fairly as I can and move on to the next story. Leave it to other people to make those value judgments.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're quoted and reported all the time in the right-wing press here now, and that's been hard work. But in the BBC is very left-wing, even though it has a statutory duty, because it's publicly funded to be unbiased. They hire people who come now almost entirely from universities. This is another big change in journalism. It's become a graduate profession. And it tends not to be a well-paid job by the standards of graduate jobs anymore because the media are in such difficulties. So it doesn't attract people who could earn more in hard sciences, mathematics, the disciplines that are least infested by postmodernist bullshit. So they're hiring from a pool of people who believe postmodernist bullshit. Over time, the organisation changes. So basically, the BBC is made up largely now of young, very ideological people who talk to each other, talk to their friends, and imagine the world agrees with them.
Yeah,
and I imagine that it's the same.
And very removed from the real world.
Yes, I mean, these are not people who are going to end up in prison, for example. So I remember when I started to look at this topic, I thought I must have missed something because it's so obviously insane. Like, it just is an extraordinarily stupid theory that should take 2 sentences to demolish. Sex is real. Evolution created it. It so happens that mammals can't change sex. I didn't make it that way. Evolution did. And there are significant differences between male and female people that require that you notice people's sexes in certain situations, unlike, for example, race or religion. Like, I don't want to know anybody's religion. I just don't want them to tell me about it. And, race, there's a few situations where someone might want to have, a black support group because black people's experiences are a bit different or something like that. I don't need to look at people's races. I don't need to know their religions. I do need to know their sex. I need to know it in all sorts of situations, anywhere privacy is engaged, anywhere fairness or strength are engaged, anywhere that's got risk assessment, obviously anything to do with sex. People have sexualities. And that's actually quite a lot of life. So it's so obviously stupid that how did it ever get off the ground? And so I kept thinking, I'm missing something. And I stayed quiet for months thinking, like, what am I missing? And then I started to say a few things. And one of the early things I said is, look, if you say that people are, like, trans women are women, you will, sure as eggs, end up putting a rapist in a women's jail. And I thought that was a slam dunk. I thought that the answer would be, oh, yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought of that. And people said, you're saying all trans women are rapists.
Well,
these were people I admired. These were people who were clever people who would never have made that logical error in any other circumstance.
Yeah, well,
it was ideological commitment, and they're never going to end up in jail themselves.
Yeah. As David Hume said, reason is a slave of passions.
Completely. Yeah. And, when you look and see what happens to people who insist on talking up about this, you can see why people would stay quiet. One of the other things people say on the free speech thing is they have this asinine comeback where they say, well, I'm listening to you, aren't I? And it's like, well, what about all the people you aren't listening to? Like, I know because I'm so out, people get onto me and they say things like, I've set up a burner email so that this can't be traced. Like, nobody's going to trace emails to me, for crying out loud. I just have to tell you you're right about everything. I work in a school. The child safeguarding risks are huge. I don't dare say anything because I'd lose my job. I'm a single mum. My kids depend upon me. Can you do something about it? Like, no, I can't. I'm one person. You haven't even told me where you are, and even if you had, I can't. It is up to you, frankly. And if you're not going to do it, no one's going to do it. So it sounds like no one's going to do it. But B, that person is not speaking. Yes, I'm speaking, but loads of other people aren't, who would be.
Well, the key...
And the second thing I'll say is I have actually suffered very major consequences.
Yeah.
So, I ended up leaving a job I loved, because I needed to do this work. It's stupid work. Like, what I'm doing is stupid. It shouldn't be necessary to say any of this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm having to say over and over again the most basic facts that everybody knows perfectly well because people are pretending they don't. I shouldn't have to do this. I liked the job I was doing. I get death threats. I get treated like shit. It's got major consequences for those of us who speak up. And I'm somebody who hasn't got trauma, isn't anxious, but people who have those things really suffer.
Yeah.
If they say anything.
Well, going back to freedom of speech, the real tragedy is the self-censorship, which you just mentioned.
That's why they attack people who speak up so much. It's why J.K. Rowling gets such hate. They're desperate to take her down because literally nobody else can speak as she can't. Yeah.
So to finish, in some of the things that I've heard you talk about what Jonathan Haidt is saying we're teaching our children, which is three of the worst things that children should be taught. Do you want to just quickly go over those?
Let me see if I can get them right. So he says we're teaching anti-CBT, so anti-cognitive behavioural therapy. He says we're teaching them that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, and that feelings are a good guide to actions. And can I remember what the third one is? Can you?
Yes, I do. Life, here we go. Life is a battle between people who are purely good and those who are purely evil.
Exactly. All of those are dreadful, dreadful beliefs. They're not only wrong, but they're harmful to our mental health. So, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is the traditional saying. And, that's not always true. Sometimes bruises or injuries are so bad that they weaken you permanently. But the sort of everyday challenges are how we grow. And we've started to teach children that ordinary everyday challenges are things that may be traumatic. And so we're clearing the way as much as we can of all the ordinary challenges. Anyone who's got a child in secondary school or university knows what I'm saying is true. So it's now the case that universities automatically give extensions if you ask. Like an academic was telling me the other day that they use an AI to answer the requests for extensions. The first extension is always granted automatically, no further question.
Wow.
And the AI looks to see when a human being will look after second or third request.
That's appalling.
So because the thing is, they know that they'll get sued quickly enough by somebody who has, a diagnosed anxiety condition, and will say that they're committing disability discrimination. But the thing is, it's become quite easy to get an anxiety diagnosis. For a start, loads of universities just say, sign a paper yourself saying you have one. They don't even ask for a formal diagnosis. But the doctor is under the same pressure. If you go into a doctor and say, I have anxiety, and the doctor says, pull yourself together, try a bit harder, don't be a wimp, that doctor will get sued. So there's no gatekeeping now to saying that you have anxiety. So the universities have just folded. They no longer impose deadlines. And the thing is, screwing up on a deadline and having to stay up all night the night before and turn in bad work that gets failed, or missing your deadline and thinking, right, I'll never do that again, that's a formative experience. It doesn't kill you. Like I always said to my kids, if you fail, the ground will not open up and it will not swallow you, and you will stand up and you'll say, that was shit, I'm going to try harder next time. And you're sweeping that out of kids' way. So what doesn't kill them isn't even being allowed to happen to them because people think it'll make them weaker. And they're becoming weaker. They don't have colliding deadlines. They're less likely to be asked to be called on in class and have to go, I didn't do the reading. And they don't have sudden death exams. Everybody has to be told they're brilliant. Grade inflation, all these ways in which you might say to yourself, I didn't do well enough there, I should have tried harder, or do you know what, I'm not good enough at that, I should try something else. And anyone who has been working in the last 10 years and has anything to do with people who've been hired will know this too. Young people, including people with very good qualifications from very good institutions, expect you to mollycoddle them. They expect you to be the person who clears any obstacles out of their way. And this is becoming very difficult in jobs like journalism, that have very significant colliding deadlines and that are fighting for their life. So that's that one. That's the doesn't kill you, make you weaker. Life is a battle between purely good and purely evil people. Nobody's purely good or purely evil. Pretty much everybody's a mixture. Even the most evil people there have been, which I don't feel that I need to make any apologia for, the actual genocidal maniacs. It's still interesting to know, how did they get to be powerful? How did they get where they are? How did they come to think the things they did? Their ideas were of their time. They were encouraged by people who definitely weren't evil but were cowardly, or who had been taught bullshit about, inferior races or whatever. So if you think just, Hitler was evil and that's all there is to say about it, you ignore the fact of what German society was doing at the time, what the beliefs were that he was brought up with. You ignore many things that you need to understand to make the world a better place. And also, you're not purely evil, are you? You're not. So you must be purely good. But actually, you're mixed like everybody else. You have weak points. You screw up. You do things that you look back on and you should feel ashamed. Everybody does. But if you say those things to yourself, that makes you evil. So it takes away accountability, and in particular, self-judgment of the sort that we all need to be better people. And what was the other one?
Feelings. Feelings are a good guide to thinking and action.
Yes.
And
yes.
always trust your always trust your feelings.
Yeah, the central thing they teach you if you do CBT, which has a decent evidence base behind it for a significant but not enormous range of mental health disorders, is that it is exactly the opposite, that the central characteristic of feelings is that they change. The only feelings that last any length of time are severe unremitting pain. If you're not in severe unremitting pain, your feelings just don't last. Depressed people, of course, can be constantly in a low mood. So, you learn to say to yourself, I'm not a bad person, I just feel bad today. I feel, one of my older boy had pretty miserable teenage years, just general standard misery, teenage misery. And he'd say to me, I feel like I'm a very bad person. And I'd say, but you're only 16. What have you done? You just can't be a bad person yet. You haven't had the chance. You just feel bad. right now, and that will change. So just wait. Read something nice, give yourself a break, go play your guitar, whatever it is, you'll feel better tomorrow. And certainly don't act. Like, don't do something based on the fact that you feel like you're a bad person, like chop off your genitals. So yeah, I mean, John Knight is completely right. And Abigail Shrier's book she's just written a book called Bad Therapy. Basically all American children are being taught this stuff in a mixture of therapy and in the way that education is going in America. The whole way that they're reshaping education and therapy in America is based on those dreadful ideas. And 40% of under 18s in America have been through some formal sort of therapy. 40. And all of them go to schools where the teachers are given shitty half-day and weekend courses on this sort of nonsense and tell them to do feeling check-ins and, be emotionally literate and things. No, all nonsense. Great. You have to ask something more cheerful.
I was going to. Well, is there hope? I mean, when I'm hearing all of these things, I mean, if we're just talking about the West has been through some trying times. I mean, there's the First World War, Second World War, the Cold War, blah, blah, blah. The thing about the West I find interesting, it can regenerate itself. It can have lows. What concerns me about what you're talking about is essentially it's an epistemological trap we're putting ourselves in. But in a sense, I suppose, positively, we have, in terms of freedom of speech, we have a very major network of, I hate this word, but alternative media. Legacy media, I mean, I have no idea, but I can't see it lasting for that much longer. It will probably last for a long time, but I think its influence will wane. I mean, in New Zealand, I think it's only 22% of people actually trust journalists. It's, the ranking of legacy media is very low. In some ways, I always think it's a good strategy to be optimistic, but can you see any optimism? Are we on the trans issue? Are we going to? Is it going to be turn around?
Totally.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you finish up on a positive note then.
I mean, the first thing I'll say is, that isn't the question that animates me. I don't do what I do because I'm optimistic. Yeah. I do what I do because I think it's essential. Yeah. Like, even if the chance was 1%. So, I mean, it's another of those sort of our feelings a guide to it. I'm just not cynical enough to say, do you know what? I can't stop them sterilising children, so I'm not even going to try.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've got to try. And that is why I wrote my book, actually. It was literally that calculation. It was when I realised that they were sterilising children, and I said the sentence to myself, I can't stop them, but perhaps I can reduce the number. So it's so important, and more people realise how important it is, that there's just more and more people who are doing something about it, even if it's going to be very hard, which it will, because there has been such significant capture of institutions. And then the second thing is, I don't think it necessarily makes people happy to be doing what's fun or what's easy. In fact, I know that doing easy stuff doesn't make people happy. Doing things that you genuinely think are important is what makes people feel like they're living a good life. And this is important. So although I'm thinking about sad things all the time, like the fact that they're sterilising kids, I wake up every day with a sense of purpose. And there are more and more people who feel like that. So those networks are growing, which makes me feel like I'm part of something as well. I would invite people to take this attitude and look around for people, what they can do in their own sphere and who they can do it with. And you will find that you do feel better about it all once you're actually acting. But also, this is not just a neo-religion, it's a very cultish neo-religion. And cults can last quite a long time and can have amazing success. But the overreach is extraordinary, and they make people so visibly and evidently unhappy. Like, whenever I look at the trans protesters, the trans rights protesters, at events that I go to, they aren't an advertisement for their worldview, to say the least. Like inside, there are energized people giving their time free to do something they regard as important, who are bringing a great deal of skills to it, who are coping with adversity very bravely. And outside, there are people who are talking absolute nonsense and being very, very hateful and childish, like doing an adult equivalent of a toddler tantrum, and who do not look like they are mentally healthy in the way that they behave. Those things become more and more evident. The more people know about this, the more they agree with me and the less they agree with the trans rights activists. And we only become more knowledgeable, not less. So the direction of travel is the right way. And then every now and then, there are really seismic shifts. I do think that the Cass Review is here. In Ireland, recently we had 2 referenda. So we have a constitution that requires you to have a referendum if you want to change it. And the trans rights lobby pushed for a change to take the word mother out of the constitution. So our constitution was written in the 1920s, and it is a bit dated. It uses language that we wouldn't use now. It says that it recognises the essential role of the mother in the home. The thing is, most mothers do spend some time in the home. Most women want to be mothers. Most mothers want to spend time with their babies more than fathers do. So if you look at it that way, you say it's recognising reality, it's recognising sexed reality, the difference between men and women. It doesn't say you have to stay in the home. Like, there are no obstacles to women working in Ireland any more than there are anywhere else. But anyway, they wanted to take the house because it was gendered language and it was obsolete, and they lied aloud about how it was holding women back in Ireland, which is a total lie. But they had to go to referendum, and they lost. Very high 70s to low 20s. There was one constituency in all of Ireland that voted for the change, and it was like 50.2 to 49.8, and it was the most rich, media-loving constituency in all of Ireland that said that. And Irish politicians are nothing if they aren't pragmatic. Like, we have a political class that has an eye to the main chance always. Suddenly it was as if nobody had ever thought this was a good idea.
Right.
Like, the week earlier they had been saying this is essential, modern Ireland, da da da. After that they're like, referendum idea? No, it doesn't matter, And it just got dropped. So every now and then we get the chance to tell them that they sod off with this nonsense in a way that they have to listen to. Or every now and then there's a genuinely good piece of work like the Cass Review that you can point to and that kicks the legs out from under something disgusting, and we just have to keep building on those. So direction of travel, knowing that you're doing the right thing. I mean, if I thought there was 0% chance I could win here, I'd still be doing it. So
well, on behalf of the world, Helen, thank you. You are an amazing person.
That's a bit grandiose.
Well, I'm a grandiose sort of guy. No, I'm serious. You're doing seriously important work, and you are so amazing at it. As I said, I've probably listened to hundreds of hours of you, and I'm still not bored. Every time I listen to it, it's fantastic, and it's been a great honour to talk to you.
I'm going to get bored at some point. Not yet, though.
Well, just work through it because we need you. And right. And thank you so much for doing the podcast. It's been a great experience.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.